Chapter 1 of Gray Lensman by E. Smith. Chapter 1. Among the world-girdling fortifications of a planet, distant indeed from star cluster AG 257-4736, there squatted sullenly a fortress quite similar to Helmuth's own. Indeed, in some respects, it was even superior to the base of him who spoke for Boskonia. It was larger and stronger. Instead of one dome, it had many. It was dark and cold withal, for its occupants had practically nothing in common with humanity save the possession of high intelligence. In the central sphere of one of the domes, there sparkled several of the peculiarly radiant globes whose counterpart had given Kinnison so seriously to think, and near them there crouched or huddled or lay at ease a many-tentacled creature indescribable to man. It was not exactly like an octopus, though spiny it did not resemble at all closely a sea cucumber, nor, although it was scaly and toothy and wingy, was it, save in the vaguest possible way, similar to a lizard, a sea serpent, or a vulture. Such a description by negatives is of course pitifully inadequate, but unfortunately it is the best that can be done. The entire attention of this being was focused within one of the globes, the obscure mechanism of which was relaying to his sense of perception from Helmuth's globe and mind a clear picture of everything which was happening within Grand Base. The corpse-littered dome was cleared to his sight. He knew that the patrol was attacking from without, knew that the ubiquitous lensman, who had already unmanned the citadel, was about to attack from within. "You have erred seriously," the entity was thinking coldly, emotionlessly into the globe, "in not deducing until after it was too late to save your base that the lensman had perfected a nullifier of sub-ethereal detection. Your contention that I am equally culpable is, I think, untenable. It was your problem, not mine. I had and still have other things to concern me. Your base is, of course, lost. Whether or not you yourself survive will depend entirely upon the adequacy of your protective devices." "But, Eichlin, you yourself pronounced them adequate." There followed an interval of silence, as though those conferring were separated by such a gulf of space that even thought, with its immeasurable velocity of propagation, required finite time to traverse it. "Pardon me. I said that they seemed adequate." "If I survive, or rather after I have destroyed this lensman, what are your orders?" Another interval. "Go to the nearest communicator and concentrate our forces, half of them to engage this patrol fleet, the remainder to wipe out all the life of Sol 3. I have not tried to give those orders direct, since all the beams are keyed to your board, and even if I could reach them, no commander in that galaxy knows that I speak for Boskonia. After you have done that, report to me here." "Instructions received and understood, Helmuth. Ending message." "Set your controls as instructed. I will observe and record. Prepare yourself. The lensman comes. Eichlin, speaking for Boskonia. Ending message." The lensman rushed. Even before he crashed the pirate screens, his own defensive zone flamed white in the beam of semi-portable projectors. and through that blaze came tearing the metallic slugs of a high-caliber machine rifle. But the lensman's screens were almost those of a battleship, his armor relatively as strong. He had at his command projectors scarcely inferior to those opposing his advance. Therefore, with every faculty of his newly enlarged mind concentrated upon that thought-screened armored head behind the bellowing gun and the flaring projectors, Kinnison held his line and forged ahead. Attentive as he was to Helmuth's thought screens, the patrolman was ready when it weakened slightly and a thought began to seep through, directed at that peculiar ball of force. He blanketed it savagely before it could even begin to take form, and attacked the screen so viciously that the Boskonian had either to restore full coverage instantly or else die there and then. Kinnison feared that force ball no longer. He still did not know what it was, but he had learned that, whatever its nature might be, it was operated or controlled by thought. Therefore it was and would remain harmless. If the pirate chief softened his screen enough to emit a thought, he would never think again. Doggedly, the lensman drove in, closer and closer. Magnetic clamps locked and held. Two steel-clad warring figures rolled into the line of fire of the ravening automatic rifle. Kinnison's armor, designed and tested to withstand even heavier stuff, held. Wherefore he came through that storm of metal unscathed. Helmuth, however, even though stronger far than the ordinary personal armor of space, failed, and thus the Boskonian died. Blasting himself upright, the patrolman shot across the inner dome to the control panel and paused, momentarily baffled. He could not throw the switches controlling the defensive screens of the gigantic outer dome. His armor, designed for the ultimate of defensive strength, could not and did not bear any of the small and detailed external mechanisms so characteristic of the ordinary spacesuit. To leave his personal tank at that time and in that environment was unthinkable, yet he was fast running out of time. A scant 15 seconds was all that remained before zero, the moment at which the hellish outputs of every watt generable by the massed fleet of the Galactic Patrol would be hurled against those screens in their furiously raving destructive might. To release the screens after that zero moment would mean his own death, instantaneous and inevitable. Nevertheless, he could open those circuits. The conservation of Boskonian property meant nothing to him. He flipped on his own projector and flashed its beam briefly across the banked panels in front of him. Insulation burst into flame, fairly exploding in its haste to disintegrate. Copper and silver ran in brilliant streams or puffed away in clouds of sparkling vapor. High-tension arcs ripped, crashed, and cracked among the writhing, dripping, flaring bus bar. The shorts burned themselves clear or blew their fuses. Every circuit opened, every Boskonian defense came down, and then, and only then, could Kinnison get into communication with his friends. "Haines," he thought crisply into his lens. "Kinnison calling." "Haines acknowledging." A thought instantly snapped back. "Hold it. We're not done yet. Have every ship in the fleet go free at once. Have them all, except yours, put out full coverage screens so that they can't look at or think into this base." A moment passed. "Done. Don't come in any closer. I'm on my way out there to you. Have your ship block every band except your personal frequency, which you and I are now on, and caution all lensmen aboard with you to stay off that channel until further notice. Now, as to you, personally, I don't like to seem to be giving orders to the Admiral of the fleet, but it may be quite essential that you concentrate upon me and think of nothing else for the next few minutes." "Right. I don't mind taking orders from you." "QX. Now we can take things a bit easier." Kinnison had so arranged matters that no one except himself could think into that stronghold, and he himself would not. He would not think into that tantalizing enigma, nor toward it, nor even of it, until he was completely ready to do so. And how many persons, I wonder, really realize just how much of a feat that was? Realize the sort of mental training that required? "How many Gamma Zeta tracers can you put out, Chief?" Kinnison asked then, more conversationally. A brief consultation, then, 10 in regular use. By tuning in all our spares, we can put out 60. At 2 diameters distance, 48 fields will surround this planet at 100% overlap. Please have that many set that way. Of the other 12, set 3 to go well outside the first sphere, say at 4 diameters out, covering the line from this planet to Lundmark's nebula. Set the last 9 to be thrown out as far as you can read them accurately, to only the first decimal on your screens, centering on the same line. Not much overlap is necessary on these backing fields. Bare contact is enough. Release nothing, of course, until I get there. And while the boys are setting things up, you might go inert. It's safe enough now, so that I can match your intrinsic velocity and come aboard." There followed the maneuvering necessary for one inert body to approach another in space. Then Kinnison's incredible housing of steel was hauled into the airlock by means of space lines attached to magnetic clamps. The outer door of the lock closed behind him, the inner one opened, and the lensman entered the flagship. First to the armory, where he clambered stiffly out of his small battleship and gave orders concerning its storage. Then to the control room, stretching and bending hugely as he went, in vast relief at his freedom from the narrow and irksome confinement which he had endured so long. Of all the men in that control room, only 2 knew Kinnison personally. All knew of him, however, and as the tall, gray-clad figure entered, there was a loud, quick cheer. "Hi, fellows, thanks." Kinnison waved a salute to the room as a whole. "Hi, Port Admiral. Hi, Commandant." He saluted Hayes and von Hohendorf as perfunctorily, and greeted them as casually as though he had last seen them an hour instead of 10 weeks before, as though the intervening time had been spent in the veriest idleness instead of in the fashion in which it actually had been spent. Old von Hohendorf greeted his erstwhile pupil cordially enough, but "Out with it," Hayes demanded. "What did you do? How did you do it? What does all this confounded rigmarole mean? Tell us all about it. All you can, I mean," he added hastily. "There's no need of secrecy now, I think." And in flashing thoughts the Gray Lensman went on to describe everything that had happened. "So, you see," he concluded, "I don't really know anything. It's all surmise, suspicion, and deduction. It may be that nothing at all will happen, in which case these precautions, while they will have been wasted effort, will have done us no harm. In case something does happen, however, and I'll bet all the tea in China that something will, we'll be ready for it." "But if what you are beginning to suspect is really true, it means that Boskonia is intergalactic in scope, wider spread even than the Patrol." "Probably, but not necessarily. It may mean only that they have bases further outside. And remember that I'm arguing on a mighty slim thread of evidence. That screen was hard and tight, and I couldn't touch the external beam, if there was one, at all. I just got part of a thought here and there. However, the thought was that galaxy, not just galaxy or this or the galaxy. And why think that way if the guy was already in this galaxy? But nobody has ever... let's skip that for now. The boys are ready for you. Take over." "QX. First we'll go free again. Don't think much if any of the stuff can come out here, but no use taking chances. Cut your screens. Now, all you Gamma Zeta men, throw out your fields, and if any of you get a puncture or even a flash, measure its position. You recording observers, step your scanners up to 50,000. QX?" "UX," the observers and recorders reported almost as one, and the Gray Lensman sat down at a plate. His mind, free at last to make the investigation from which it had been so long and so sternly barred, flew down into and through the dome, to and into that cryptic globe so tantalizingly poised in the air of the center. The reaction was practically instantaneous, so rapid that any ordinary mind could have perceived nothing at all. So rapid that even Kinnison's consciousness recorded only a confused, blurred impression. But he did see something. In that fleeting millionth of a second, he sensed a powerful, malignant mental force. A force backing multiplex scanners and subethereal stress fields interlocked in peculiarly unidentifiable patterns. For that ball was, as Kinnison had more than suspected, a potent agency indeed. It was, as he had thought that it must be, a communicator. But it was far more than that. Ordinarily harmless enough, it could be so set as to become an infernal machine at the vibrations of any thought not in a certain coded sequence. And Helmuth had so set it. Therefore, at the touch of the patrolman's thought, it exploded, liberating instantaneously the unimaginable forces with which it was charged. More, it sent out waves which, attuned to detonating receivers, touched off strategically placed stores of duodecaplylatomate, duodec, that concentrated essence of atomic violence than which science has even yet failed to develop a more devastating. "Hell's jingling bells!" Port Admiral Haynes grunted in stunned amazement, then subsided into silence, eyes riveted upon his plate. For to the human eye, dome, fortress, and planet had disappeared in one catalysmic incandescent sphere of flame. But the observers of the Galactic Patrol did not depend upon eyesight alone. Their scanners had been working at ultra-fast speed, and as soon as it became clear that none of the ships of the fleet had been endangered, Kinnison asked that certain of the spools be run into a visitank at normal tempo. There, slowed to a speed at which the eye could clearly discern sequences of events, the two old lensmen and the young one studied with care the three-dimensional pictures of what had happened, pictures taken from points of projection close to and even within the doomed structure itself. Deliberately, the ball of force opened up, followed an inappreciable instant later by the secondary centers of detonation, all expanding magically into spherical volumes of blindingly brilliant annihilation. There were as yet no flying fragments. No inert fragment can fly from duodec in the first few instants of its detonation, for the detonation of duodec is propagated at the velocity of light, so that the entire mass disintegrates in a period of time to be measured only in fractional trillionths of a second. Its detonation pressure and the temperature have never been measured save indirectly, since nothing will hold it except a Q-type helix of pure force. And even those helixes, which perforce must be practically open at both ends, have to be designed and powered to withstand pressures and temperatures obtaining only in the cores of suns. Imagine, if you can, what would happen if some 50,000 metric tons of material from the innermost core of Sirius B were to be taken to Grand Base, separated into 25 packages, each package placed at a strategic point, and all restraint instantaneously removed. What would have happened then was what actually was happening. As had been said, for moments nothing moved except the ever-expanding spheres of destruction. Nothing could move. The inertia of matter itself held it in place until it was too late. Everything close to those centers of action simply flared into turgid incandescence and added its contribution to the already hellish whole. As the spheres expanded, their temperatures and pressures decreased, and the action became somewhat less violent. Matter no longer simply disappeared. Instead, plates and girders, even gigantic structural members, bent, buckled, and crumbled. Walls blew outward and upward. Huge chunks of metal and of masonry, many with fused and dripping edges, began to fly in all directions. And not only or principally upward was directed the force of those inconceivable explosions. Downward the effect was, if possible, even more catastrophic, since conditions there approximated closely the oft-argued meeting between the irresistible force and the immovable object. The planet was, to all intents and purposes, immovable, the duodeck to the same degree irresistible. The result was that the entire planet was momentarily blown apart. A vast chasm was blasted deep into its interior, and gravity temporarily overcome, stupendous cracks and fissures began to yawn. Then, as the pressure decreased, the core stuff of the planet became molten and began to wreak its volcanic havoc. Gravity, once more master of the situation, took hold. The cracks and chasms closed, extruding uncountable cubic miles of fiery lava and metal. The entire world shivered and shuddered in a gargantuan cosmic ague. The explosion blew itself out. The hot gases and vapors cooled. The steam condensed. The volcanic dust disappeared. There lay the planet, but changed, hideously and awfully changed. Where Grand Base had been, there remained nothing whatever to indicate that anything wrought by man had ever been there. Mountains were leveled, valleys were filled, continents and oceans had shifted and were still shifting, visibly. Earthquakes, volcanoes, and other seismic disturbances, instead of decreasing, were increasing in violence minute by minute. Helmuth's planet was, and would for years remain, a barren and uninhabitable world. Well, Haynes, who had been holding his breath unconsciously, released it in an almost explosive sigh. That is inescapably and incontrovertibly that. I was going to use that base, but it looks as though we'll have to get along without it. Without comment, Kinnison turned to the Gamma Zeta observers. Any traces? He asked. It developed that 3 of the fields had shown activity. Not merely traces or flashes, but solid punctures showing the presence of a hard, tight beam. And those 3 punctures were in the same line, a line running straight out into intergalactic space. Kinnison took careful readings on the line, then stood motionless. Feet wide apart, hands jammed into pockets, head slightly bent, eyes distant. He stood there, unmoving, thinking with all the power of his brain. "I want to ask 3 questions," the old commandant of cadets interrupted his cogitations finally. "Was Helmuth Boskone or not? Have we got them licked or not? What do we do next, besides the mopping up of those 18 super-maulers?" To all 3, the answer is, I don't know. Kinnison's face was stern and hard. You know as much about the whole thing as I do. I haven't held back a thing that I even suspect. I did not tell you that Helmuth was Boskone. I said that everyone in any position to judge, including myself, was as sure that he was as one could be about anything that could not be proved. I firmly believed that he was. The presence of this communicator line, and the other stuff I have told you about, has destroyed that belief in my mind. However, we do not actually know any more than we did before. It is no more certain now that Helmuth was not Boskone than it was before that he was Boskone. The second question ties in with the first, and so does the third, but I see that the mopping up has started. While von Hohendorf and Kinnison had been talking, Haynes had issued orders, and the Grand Fleet, divided roughly and with difficulty into 18 parts, went raggedly outward to surround the 18 outlying fortresses. But, and surprisingly enough to the patrol forces, the reduction of those hulking monsters was to prove no easy task. The Boskonians had witnessed the destruction of Helmuth's Grand Base. Their master plates were dead. Try as they would, they could get in touch with no one with authority to give them orders, with no one to whom they could report their present plight. Nor could they escape. The slowest mauler in the patrol fleet could have caught any one of them in space of minutes. To surrender was not even thought of. Better far to die a clean death in the blazing holocaust of space battle than to be thrown ignominiously into the lethal chambers of the patrol. There was not, there could not be any question of pardon or of sentence to mere imprisonment, for the strife between civilization and Boskonia in no respect resembled the wars between two fundamentally similar and friendly nations, which small green Terra knew so frequently of old. It was a galaxy-wide struggle for survival between two diametrically opposed, mutually exclusive, and absolutely incompatible cultures. A duel to the death in which quarter was neither asked nor given. A conflict which, except for the single instance which Kinnison himself had engineered, was, and of stern necessity had to be, one of ruthless, complete, and utter extinction. Die, then, the pirates knew they must, and, although adherents to a scheme of existence monstrous indeed to our way of thinking, they were in no sense cowards. Not like cornered rats did they conduct themselves, but fought like what they were, courageous beings hopelessly outnumbered and outpowered, unable either to escape or to choose the field of operations, grimly resolved that in their passing they would take full toll of the minions of that detested and despised galactic civilization. Therefore, in suicidal glee, Boskonian engineers rigged up a fantastically potent weapon of offense, tuned in their defensive screens, and hung poised in space, awaiting calmly the massed attack so sure to come. Up flashed the heavy cruisers of the patrol, serenely confident. Although of little offensive strength, these vessels mounted tractors and pressors of prodigious power, as well as defensive screens which, theoretically, no projector-driven beam of force could puncture. They had engaged mauler after mauler of Boskonia's mightiest, and never yet had one of those screens gone down. Theirs the task of immobilizing the opponent, since, as is of course well known, it is, under any ordinary conditions, impossible to wreak any hurt upon an object which is both inertialess and at liberty to move in space. It simply darts away from the touch of the harmful agent, whether it is immaterial beam or material substance. Formerly, the attachment of 2 or 3 tractors were all that was necessary to ensure immobility and thus vulnerability. But with the Valancian development of a shear plane to cut tractor beams, a new technique became necessary. This was englobement, in which a dozen or more vessels surrounded the proposed victim in space and held it motionless at the center of a sphere by means of pressors which could not be cut or evaded. Serene, then, and confident, the heavy cruisers rushed out to englobe the Boskonian fortress. Flash! 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 3 points of light, as unbearably brilliant as atomic vortices, sprang into being upon the fortress's side. 3 needle rays of inconceivable energy lashed out, hurtling through the cruiser's outer screens as though they had been so much inactive webbing, through the second and through the first, through the wall shield, even that ultra-powerful field scarcely flashing as it went down, through the armor, violating the prime tenet then held, and which had just been referred to, that no object free in space could be damaged. In this case, so unthinkably vehement was the thrust, the few atoms of substances in the space surrounding the doomed cruisers afforded resistance enough. Through the ship itself, a ravening cylinder of annihilation. For perhaps a second, certainly no longer, those incredible, those undreamed-of beams persisted, before winking out into blackness. But that second had been long enough. 3 riddled hulks lay dead in space, and as the 3 original projectors went black, 3 more flared out. Then 3 more. 9 of the mightiest of civilization's ships of war were riddled before the others could hurl themselves backward out of range. Most of the officers of the flagship were stunned into temporary inactivity by that shocking development, but 2 reacted almost instantly. "Thorndyke," the Admiral snapped. "What did they do, and how?" And Kinnison, not speaking at all, leaped to a certain panel to read for himself the analysis of those incredible beams of force. "They made super needle rays out of their main projectors," Master Technician Laverne Thorndyke reported crisply. They must have shorted everything they've got onto them to burn them out that fast." "Those beams were hot, plenty hot," Kinnison corroborated the findings. "Those recorders go to 5 billion and have a factor of safety of 10. Even that wasn't anywhere nearly enough. Everything in the recorder circuits blew." "But how could they handle them?" von Hohendorf began to ask. "They didn't. They pointed them and died," Thorndyke explained grimly. "They traded one projector and its crew for one cruiser and its crew. A good trade from their viewpoint." "There will be no more such trades," Haines declared. Nor were there. The patrol had maulers enough to englobe the enemy craft at a distance greater even than the effective range of those suicidal beams, and it did so. Shielding screens cut off the Boskonians' intake of cosmic power, and the relentless beaming of the bulldog maulers began. For hour after hour it continued, the cordon ever tightening as the victim's power lessened. And finally, even the gargantuan accumulators of the immense fortresses were drained. Their screens went down under the hellish fury of the maulers' incessant attack, and in a space of minutes thereafter the structures and their contents ceased to exist save as atomic detritus. The Grand Fleet of the Galactic Patrol remade its formation after a fashion and set off toward the galaxy at touring blast. And in the control room of the flagship, Gray Lensman brought a very serious conference to a close. "You saw what happened to Helmuth's planet." Kinnison's voice was oddly hard. "And I gave you all I could get of the thought about the destruction of all life upon Sol 3. A big enough duodeck bomb in the bottom of an ocean would do it. I don't really know anything, except that we hadn't better let them catch us sleeping at the switch again. We've got to be up on our toes every second." And the Gray Lensman, face set and stern, strode off to his quarters. End of Chapter 1.